Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. It is a pleasure to have you here with me today as we dissect the chaotic and increasingly dangerous geopolitical landscape that is unfolding right before our eyes. Thank you so much for tuning in. I deeply appreciate your time and your commitment to understanding the hard truths of international politics. Please stay tuned for our upcoming analyses, where we will continue to cut through the noise and get to the heart of what really matters for the United States and the world. Europe's suicide note: why the old continent is sabotaging Trump's exit strategy in Ukraine. We are witnessing a moment of profound geopolitical absurdity, a situation so fraught with danger and irony that it would be comical if the stakes were not so catastrophic. Just days ago, in early December 2025, while the United States government, under the renewed administration of Donald Trump, desperately attempts to extricate itself from the quagmire in Eastern Europe, we see the leaders of Europe virtually throwing themselves across the tracks to stop the train of diplomacy. Vladimir Putin, sitting in Moscow, has just accused Europe of actively sabotaging peace talks. And for once, if you look at the structural incentives and the panic currently gripping Brussels and Berlin, the Russian president is likely telling the truth. We have American envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner walking the halls of the Kremlin, trying to hammer out a deal to end a war that has bled Ukraine dry and distracted Washington from its true competitor in East Asia, only to find that our so-called allies in Europe are the ones whispering no in Kyiv's ear. This is the death rattle of liberal hegemony. It is the sound of a European security architecture built on the fantasy of perpetual American protection, crumbling in real time. To understand why we are here and why Vladimir Putin is threatening that Russia is ready for war with Europe if they continue this obstruction, we have to look past the moralizing headlines and the teary-eyed rhetoric about democracy that dominates the mainstream media. We must look at the cold, hard distribution of power. For 30 years, since the end of the Cold War, the foreign policy establishment in Washington, the blob, as we call it, and their counterparts in Europe, have operated under a delusion. They believed they could expand the Western security umbrella, NATO, right up to Russia's doorstep, turn Ukraine into a Western bulwark, and that Russia would simply accept it. They believed that power politics was over, that realism was dead, and that the liberal order would conquer the globe. I warned for years that this would lead to disaster. I warned in 2014 that we were leading Ukraine down the primrose path to destruction, and now, in late 2025, the bill has come due. The events of this week are the culmination of that failed strategy. The Trump administration, driven by a rudimentary but accurate realist instinct, understands a fundamental truth that the rest of the Western elite refuses to admit. The United States has no vital strategic interest in who controls the Donbass. We have no vital interest in whether Crimea sits on a Russian or Ukrainian map. Our vital interest, our only existential strategic challenge, is China. Every dollar we spend, every Patriot battery we send, and every ounce of diplomatic capital we burn in Ukraine is a gift to Beijing. Donald Trump, for all his unpredictability, grasps this zero-sum game. He wants out. He wants a deal. And he sent his envoys to Moscow to get it. But here is where the tragedy deepens. Europe cannot afford for the United States to leave. For decades, European nations have hollowed out their militaries, spent their budgets on generous social welfare programs, and lectured the world on human rights, all while hiding behind American muscle. They free-rode on American security guarantees. Now, faced with a United States that is looking to pivot away, they are terrified. They are not sabotaging the peace talks because they care about the sovereignty of Ukraine in some abstract moral sense. If they truly cared about Ukrainians, they would have pushed for a settlement years ago before hundreds of thousands of young men were slaughtered in a war they could not win. No, they are sabotaging the talks because a peace deal that ratifies Russian territorial gains and neutrality for Ukraine is a signal that the American security blanket is being withdrawn. It is a signal that Article 5 is not a magic wand. If the war ends on Russia's terms, Europe is left alone on the continent with a battle-hardened, mobilized great power in the East, and they have no capacity to deter it on their own. So, when Putin says Europe is blocking the peace process and making unacceptable demands, he is describing a Europe that is desperate to keep the United States tethered to the continent. They want the war to continue, not because Ukraine can win. Everyone with a map and a calculator knows Ukraine cannot win, but because as long as the war continues, the United States remains entangled. They are willing to fight to the last Ukrainian to keep the Americans in Europe. It is a cynical, tragic, and ultimately doomed strategy, and it is dangerous. Because what the Europeans fail to understand, or perhaps choose to ignore, is the security dilemma they are triggering in Moscow. Look at this from the Russian perspective, and remember, understanding the adversary's perspective is not condoning it. It is the first rule of survival in international politics. For the Russians, this war was never about recreating the Soviet Union or conquering Europe. Those are fairy tales invented by Western propagandists to justify their own blunders. For Russia, this war was about an existential threat, the presence of a hostile military alliance on their most vulnerable border. They view Ukraine in NATO as we would view China establishing a military alliance with Mexico and stationing missiles in Tijuana. We would never tolerate it. We would wreck Mexico before we allowed it. That is exactly what Russia has done to Ukraine. Now, in 2025, Russia feels it is winning. Their economy has not collapsed. Their military machine has adapted. They have ground the Ukrainian army down through sheer attrition. Why should they accept a peace deal that leaves the door open for a future NATO expansion? This is why the European sabotage is so reckless. By insisting on security guarantees that look like NATO membership, or by demanding Russia return land it has conquered with blood, the Europeans are reinforcing Putin's belief that the West is implacable. They are proving his thesis that the West wants to destroy Russia. When a great power feels an existential threat, and when it feels its diplomatic off-ramps are being blocked by weaker powers acting as spoilers, the risk of escalation skyrockets. Putin's warning that he is ready for war with Europe is not bluster. It is a classic deterrence signal. He is saying, if you do not let the Americans make a deal, and if you try to escalate this yourselves, I will hit you, and I will hit you hard. And the terrifying reality is that Europe is not ready. The German Bundeswehr is a shadow of its former self. The British Army is too small to field a credible division. France has capacity, but not enough to hold the eastern flank alone. Without the United States, Europe is a geopolitical vacuum. But let us bring this back to the United States, because that is where our primary concern lies. Why is the Trump administration pushing this deal now? It is not out of charity. It is because the economic and strategic costs of this proxy war have become unsustainable for the American people. We have poured hundreds of billions of dollars into a black hole. We have depleted our stockpiles of 155 millimeters artillery shells, javelins, and Stingers weapons we may desperately need in the Taiwan Strait in the coming years. And for what? Has the Russian economy collapsed? No. Is the ruble rubble? No. Has the Putin regime fallen? No. In fact, by weaponizing the dollar and cutting Russia off from the SWIFT system, we have inadvertently driven Russia into the arms of China, creating the very Eurasian hegemon that American geostrategy has tried to prevent for a century. We have united our two greatest rivals. It is a masterclass in strategic incompetence. The American middle class feels this every day. The inflation we have seen, the disruption in energy markets, the instability in global supply chains, much of this can be traced back to the economic war we declared on a resource superpower. The blob in Washington, the think tank experts, the State Department careerists, the pundits on cable news, they don't pay the price. They live in a bubble of abstraction. But the mechanic in Ohio, the farmer in Iowa, the nurse in Arizona, they pay the price. They pay it at the gas pump, they pay it in the grocery store, and their children pay it when they are sent to man bases in Poland or Romania to protect wealthy Europeans who refuse to pay for their own defense. Donald Trump, for all his flaws, speaks to that frustration. He understands that a foreign policy that ignores the economic well-being of its own citizens is a foreign policy that cannot stand. So we have this surreal dynamic. The United States, the architect of NATO, is trying to close the chapter on NATO expansion in Ukraine. Russia, the invader, is signaling it will take a deal if its core security needs are met. And Europe, the supposed beacon of peace and diplomacy, is the one screaming for more war. The Europeans are demanding that the U.S. stay and fight, or rather, that the U.S. pay and supply while Ukrainians fight. This is the behavior of a panic dependent. It is the behavior of a teenager who realizes their parents are selling the house and moving away. They are lashing out. But we must dig deeper into the deal itself. The reports indicate that the U.S. proposal involves freezing the conflict along current lines, perhaps conceding de facto control of the Donbass and Crimea to Russia, and imposing limits on Ukraine's military relationship with NATO. In the world of realism, this is the only logical outcome. It was the only logical outcome in 2022 and in 2023 and in 2024. The difference is that now, in late 2025, Ukraine has lost significantly more territory and more men than they would have if they had negotiated in Istanbul in the early days of the war. This is the tragedy of fighting for the best possible deal. In a war of attrition against a larger power, the best deal is usually available at the start. Every day you wait, the balance of power shifts against you, and the terms get worse. Europe's objection to this deal, specifically their reported insertion of unacceptable demands, likely revolves around the issue of security guarantees. Europe wants a tripwire. They want a commitment that if Russia attacks again, the U.S. will be automatically at war. They want to turn the ceasefire line into a new Iron Curtain with American troops permanently stationed on the Ukrainian side. But Russia will never accept that. Russia's war aim was to neutralize Ukraine, to create a buffer of frozen conflict where the other side is armed to the teeth by NATO is not a buffer. It is a ticking time bomb, and the United States should not accept it either. Why should we shackle ourselves to a conflict in a region that does not matter to our security? If we give a security guarantee to Ukraine, we are effectively bringing them into NATO by the back door. We are committing ourselves to World War III for the sake of the Donbass. It makes no strategic sense. The sabotage Putin speaks of is also likely related to economic sanctions. Europe has tied its entire moral identity to the sanctions regime. To lift them now, to normalize relations with Russia as part of a peace deal, would be a humiliating admission of defeat. The European political class, the Ursula von der Leyens, the Macrons, the Scholz successors, have staked their careers on the idea that Russia can be totally isolated and defeated. If Trump cuts a deal that reintegrates Russia into the global energy market or unfreezes Russian assets, the European narrative collapses. Their voters will ask, why did we suffer through high energy prices? Why did we deindustrialize Germany? Why did we sacrifice our economy if the end result is a handshake in Moscow? The political instability this would unleash across Europe is immense. So, the leaders cling to the war. They cling to the conflict because the peace is politically fatal for them. This brings us to the most dangerous element of the current situation, the potential for a European-led escalation. Putin said, if Europe starts a war, we are ready. What does this mean? It implies that as the U.S. pulls back, some European states, perhaps Poland, perhaps the Baltics, encouraged by France or Britain, might try to intervene directly. They might send troops to secure western Ukraine. They might authorize long-range strikes deep into Russia using European missiles independent of U.S. command. This would be suicidal. Russia possesses thousands of tactical nuclear weapons. Russia views this conflict as existential. If European troops enter Ukraine, or if European missiles strike Moscow, the Russians will not respond with a strongly worded letter. They will respond with overwhelming force, and the question then becomes, will the United States trade New York for Warsaw? Will we trade Chicago for Paris? The answer, if we are rational, is no. But the Europeans are betting that we are irrational. They are betting that we will be dragged in to save them from their own folly. This is the classic chain-ganging problem of alliances. We are chained to partners who are reckless because they believe we will pay the bail. We need to look at the domestic American context again. We have a divided country. We have a massive national debt. We have a border crisis. We have a crumbling infrastructure. The idea that we should risk nuclear war with Russia because European leaders are too proud to admit they made a mistake is an obscenity. The American interest is clear. Peace in Europe, even an ugly peace, so we can focus on Asia and on rebuilding our own nation. The values argument is hollow. We deal with Saudi Arabia, we deal with Vietnam, we dealt with Stalin to beat Hitler. In international politics, you deal with the world as it is, not as you wish it to be. Russia is a great power. It is not going away. We need to find a modus vivendi with them. Furthermore, we must consider the signal this sends to the rest of the world. The global south, India, Brazil, South Africa, they are watching. They see the double standards. They see us preaching about sovereignty in Ukraine while we violate it elsewhere. They see us weaponizing the financial system. They are moving away from the dollar. They are joining BRICS. The longer this war drags on, the more isolated the West becomes. Not Russia, the West. We are consolidating the rest of the world against us. A peace deal, brokered by Trump, could begin to reverse this damage. It could show that the U.S. is capable of pragmatic diplomacy, that we are not just a chaotic disruptor, but a stabilizer. But Europe is standing in the way. Let's be precise about what sabotage means in this context. It means leaking sensitive details of the negotiations to the press to kill them. It means promising Ukraine bilateral security deals that contradict the U.S.-Russia framework. It means engaging in what we call spoiler behavior. It is the diplomatic equivalent of slashing the tires of the car that is supposed to drive you to safety. And why? Because they are afraid of the driver. They are afraid of a world where America acts like a normal nation state, pursuing its own interests, rather than a benevolent hegemon providing welfare to the world. The irony is that by sabotaging the deal, Europe is making the outcome worse for Ukraine. If these talks fail, Russia will not stop. They will continue to grind forward. They will take Odessa. They will take Kharkiv. They will turn Ukraine into a rump state, a dysfunctional wasteland, and eventually the U.S. will leave anyway. We will leave because we have to. The pivot to Asia is not a choice. It is a necessity dictated by the rise of a peer competitor in China. So Europe will eventually be left alone with a Russia that is even more victorious, even more angry, and even less willing to compromise. By blocking a deal now, Europe is ensuring a catastrophe later. We are also seeing the limits of soft power. The European Union is an economic giant, but a military worm. They thought they could subdue Russia with regulations, sanctions, and moral shaming. They brought a law book to a knife fight. Putin operates in the realm of hard power. He counts divisions, artillery shells, and hypersonic missiles. He does not care about EU resolutions. The Europeans are realizing that in a crunch, soft power is no power at all. This realization is causing a psychological breakdown in European capitals. They are lashing out at the U.S. for trying to make a hard power deal, a deal based on territory and military limits, because it exposes the irrelevance of their own worldview. John Mearsheimer's theory of offensive realism tells us that states seek to maximize their power to ensure their survival. Russia is doing that by securing its periphery. The U.S. is doing that, or should be, by pivoting to check its only real rival, China. Europe is the anomaly. Europe is trying to maximize its dependence. It is trying to cling to a status quo that is gone. This is dangerous because dying empires and dying orders often lash out. The frantic diplomacy we see from Europe, the accusations, the attempts to derail the Witkoff-Kushner mission, these are the spasms of a dying order. So what should the United States do? We must be ruthless. We must tell our European allies that the party is over. We must tell them that we are cutting a deal with Russia to end this war, and they can either get on board or get left behind. We cannot let the tail wag the dog. We cannot let Poland or Estonia or even Germany dictate American foreign policy. The risks are too high. If Europe wants to fight Russia, let them fight. Let them send their own sons. Let them spend their own euros. But they won't. They want us to do it. And that is why they are sabotaging the peace, to keep us hooked. The path forward is clear, though difficult. The U.S. must bypass the European saboteurs. We must negotiate directly with Moscow and Kyiv. We must force Kyiv to accept the reality of the battlefield, land for peace, neutrality for survival. And we must offer Russia a reintegration path that peels them away from China. It will be ugly. It will be called appeasement by the ignorant voices on cable news, but it is not appeasement, it is strategy. Appeasement is giving away something you can defend to avoid a fight you can win. This is acknowledging that we cannot defend Ukraine without risking national suicide, and that the fight itself is not in our interest. We are walking a tightrope. On one side is a humiliating but necessary peace. On the other is an uncontrolled escalation driven by panicked allies. Donald Trump, consciously or not, is trying to walk that rope to safety. The Europeans are shaking the rope. We must stop them. We must see this for what it is. A desperate attempt to maintain a fantasy world that died the moment Russian tanks crossed the border in 2022. The world of 1991 is gone. The unipolar moment is over. We are in a multipolar world of ruthless power competition. It is time we started acting like it. It is time we stopped letting Europe dictate our survival. If we fail to close this deal, if we allow the sabotage to succeed, we are looking at a 2026 of profound darkness, a year where the war expands, where the U.S. is dragged deeper into the abyss, and where China smiles as its two potential rivals destroy each other. We must not let that happen. We must choose the logic of realism over the delusions of liberalism. Thank you for listening. This is a critical time, and understanding these dynamics is the best defense against the propaganda that floods our screens. Would you like me to analyze the specific details of the proposed 27-point peace plan mentioned in the reports, and how it aligns with historical precedents for great power settlements?